After the fall of Babylon and the wedding feast of the Lamb, the book of Revelation then goes into what many consider to be an extended version of the event of Armageddon. After the pouring of the sixth bowl, the kings of the earth gather at a place called Armageddon to do battle against God and his holy ones. Well, now we see that battle taking place as the kings of the earth do battle against the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And in this vision, we see a couple of images that are reminiscent of previous images we've already seen in the book of Revelation. First of all, John sees one riding forth on a great white horse. That calls to mind the first rider of the four riders of the Apocalypse, the rider with the white horse that symbolized conquest. Now, a white horse is coming forth with a rider to conquer, again, in one final confrontation. The rider comes forth in a garment drenched in blood, identifying it with Jesus further by one who died on the cross and redeemed us by his blood, but also his eyes are a fiery flame, and out of his mouth comes a sharp sword. Both of those call to mind the image of Christ that John the seer had at the very beginning of Revelation, when he sees one like a son of man standing amid the lampstands and holding the 7 stars in his hand. Now we see this figure riding forth in this final confrontation. We also see images that are reminiscent to the mythological victory banquet image that comes from the ancient Canaanite mythology of Baal. If you recall, every year in that cycle, Baal rides in on the clouds, the storm cloud, over the sea, the realm of death, and if he is victorious over the sea, he reigns upon the region, and they celebrate with a great banquet of the harvest. The banquet follows the victory. First there's the battle, then there's the banquet. In this particular case, however, it's done in reverse. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords rides forth, and the banquet is declared, in which all of God's holy ones and even creatures of creation feast on the flesh and the blood of enemies. But it's after the banquet that the kings of the earth declare their battle, declare their war on the King of Kings. Here again is where we see the irony of Armageddon, because as we saw with the four riders of the Apocalypse, heaven calls for war, and war comes, bringing that social upheaval for those who persecute God's holy people. As we saw in the sixth trumpet, again, heaven calls for war, and in the four angels from the east, war comes, bringing social upheaval. However, with the pouring of the sixth bowl, it is the kings of the earth, gathered by the evil spirits in the form of frogs, that declare war and that call for war, which we now see spelled out in this portion of Revelation. But unlike the times when heaven calls for war, when the forces of evil and the kings of the earth call for war, war does not come. That is the great irony of Armageddon. Rather, it is a victory, the victory of the King of Kings, in which the kings of the earth have no hope of even fighting against the King of Kings, let alone being victorious over him. And the victory comes after the celebration of the great banquet. It is on this victory, after the kings of the earth are overthrown, that 2 of the 3 figures of the anti-Trinity are then dealt with. The beast that comes from the sea, which we refer to as the Antichrist, and the beast that came from the earth, which Revelation refers to as the false prophet, are now thrown into the fiery pool of burning sulfur. So 2 of those 3 images and figures of evil are dealt with as a result of the victory of the King of Kings. It is after this that the dragon is now taken and confined, and he is confined for a period of 1,000 years. A few years back, when the world was anticipating the change of the millennium, going from the year 1999 to the year 2000, there was a great deal of anticipation with regard to a phenomenon known as the Y2K bug, and this catastrophe that would occur with the computer systems of the world with the change from one millennium to the next. This is nothing new, as whenever there's a period of 1,000 years, sometimes there's a great anticipation of what is to happen, because after 1,000 years, there's the expectation of Christ coming again. And this is a result of the passage in the book of Revelation in which the great millennium is spoken of, and is the only time in the entire Bible that the idea of a millennium, or a period of 1,000 years, is mentioned, chapter 20 in the book of Revelation. And it's not so much to understand it as a literal period of time, because remember, we can't take the symbols and images and numbers literally, but as a literary tool, it connotes a long period of time, an astronomically long period of time. And when you compare that to the period mentioned in apocalyptic literature of, say, 3.5 years, or a year, 2 years, and half a year, or 42 months, which we have heard previously in the book of Revelation and in the book of Daniel, the idea of 1,000 years is spoken of in comparison to the time of trials, persecution, and suffering. And compared to 1,000 years, 3.5 years is very minuscule and in fact virtually insignificant. And so that's the idea that's being conveyed, that the reign of Christ will be for 1,000 years. So how much more could we be patient during this time of suffering and struggle and trial? But in the midst of this, we also see an important thing said about those who engage and participate in these sufferings, who are victims of that suffering. Because it is said that those who were beheaded for their witness to the faith, in other words, the martyrs for Christianity, will rise and will reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, what does that say? It says that we are not to lose hope when we are persecuted or when we suffer, because there is a special place that those who have borne witness with their lives have in the kingdom that is to come. And it says they will rise first and will reign with Christ for 1,000 years, and this is the first resurrection. And here again in the book of Revelation, in this particular scene, we hear yet another beatitude of the 7 that we see in this book. Blessed are those who share in the first resurrection. And so again, we have the period of persecution that is nothing compared to the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And those who engaged in suffering, martyrdom, who suffer persecution, share in that first resurrection. It is at the end of this that the book says the dragon will be unleashed, having been chained for 1,000 years, and be released for a short period of time in his attempt to lead the people astray. Here again we see the references to Gog and Magog, which we saw previously in the writings of Ezekiel, that great battle against Gog from Magog before God restores his people Israel and the temple is rebuilt. Here again, Gog and Magog represent all the kings of the earth that oppose God's holy people. And in that, God will have his final victory. And finally, that remaining figure of the anti-Trinity, the dragon, is thrown into the fiery pool of burning sulfur. We don't take the number 1,000 as a literal number, but in the comparative sense, that the reign of Christ that is to come will make this current period of difficulty and suffering, especially the suffering of the early Christians at the hands of the Roman Empire, and when you think about it, any period of suffering in any time of Christian history, including today in various parts of the world. This passage serves as a reminder that this period of suffering is insignificant compared to the 1,000 years of Christ's reign that is to come. And it admonishes and empowers those to endure that suffering so that they can share in that first resurrection and reign with Christ.